guys, it's Ian at SS8000 Cars, and today we have in the drive the brand new Porsche Macan. Now, I know quite a few of you will probably say looks very similar to the old model, and certainly in the last 3 months we have featured both the petrol and the diesel from the previous generation Macan. But what I wanted to focus a little on today was obviously some of the differences, and also chat a little bit about the Macan and where it sits in the Porsche range, which is probably where I should start. The Macan is hugely important to Porsche. It outsold every other model in their range in 2017. Interestingly, it outsells the Cayman, the Boxster, the 911 and the Panamera all put together, and accounts for 40% of total Porsche revenue during the year. The headline news on the new Macan is that Porsche have dropped from the range all their diesel engines. So although it was an Audi Q5 sourced diesel, there's no question at all that that's a brave move on Porsche's behalf, because the diesel, I imagine, was probably their best selling individual variant on the in the Macan range. It remains to be seen how big a problem that will be. My own belief is that the new diesel range of engines are much more efficient than they were. They're better in terms of CO2 emissions by around 20%. In my opinion, that may turn out to be short-sighted, or it may turn out to be great insight into the car industry, but the new Audi engines, diesel engines, tend to be 20% less emissions as far as CO2 is concerned, and the same NO2, which of course, as you know, is the substance that's more harmful to humans and which caused a lot of the trouble a few years ago with Dieselgate. Okay, moving on to the Porsche Macan. Differences on the outside, unless you know the models in some depth, are quite difficult to spot. We have new side lights and indicator lamps. We have a slightly new design grille with a more prominent front splitter. This one has the full neon lights. Let's sort of move around the car. I quite like it in red. Has the 20-inch wheels. I have always thought that the Macan looked a little over-wheeled with its 21 inches. I slightly prefer the 20-inch wheels to the 21 inches that were on our Macan Turbo. The big change in terms of design on the new Macan is obviously the new Porsche rear light, which runs the entire length of the back of the car. So basically from here to here is side lights, and then braking lights are the standard Porsche 4 braking lights plus the high level brake. 4 exhausts I think is an option on the standard Macan. This car has the base level engine, which is really a development of the Golf GTI engine, so 2 litre 4-cylinder producing 242 brake horsepower, which of course, as you know, in Golf R form they've got up to 296 brake horsepower. Have a quick look at the engine. I like the way actually the lights sort of sit on the body, and there's a sort of a gap. I mean, it's a very clean looking engine, but it's not a big engine, and as usual the engine cover really hides any of the specific engine details. But 242 brake horsepower. It's the second Macan in the range at the moment, where you have the Macan S, which is the 3 litre 6-cylinder engine producing 345, and that's quite a gap. It looks quite small sitting there when you compare it to the 3.6 twin turbo engine that we had in our Macan turbo, but you know, it is a smaller engine, I guess. Put that down. Nice bonnet, like the bonnet. And eventually we'll end up with the Macan turbo, which will produce somewhere north of 400. Some people are saying 430 HP is about where it'll be, which is coincidentally about the same as the previous Porsche Macan with performance pack had. I suppose you'd say the big news is inside. Right guys, you join me inside the car, and really the first thing I want to mention, apart from the fact, as you can see this car has Sport Chrono, is the major difference between the new model Macan and the previous generation, and that is the 10.4-inch screen across the centre of the dash at the top of the center console. I think that's really smart, and I also think it really brings the car bang up to date, because this is really at the leading edge of all the infotainment centers out there. It's the best I've come across, and I've driven a lot of cars. The one in the Panamera is slightly bigger, but that's because you have a slightly bigger dash. To operate this, you put your hand towards the screen itself, and a secondary number of dials come up here. So you can then choose, as we're in nav, map, destination, or favorite, and that really is the same for all the cars. All the controls. As soon as you move over to car, then we get control, trip, and chrono. So I'll go back to nav. One thing you've probably noticed in this is that we've not got the touch buttons that we have in the Panamera and the Cayenne. Porsche have decided to stick with the push buttons, so you know, real buttons. Press it and it comes on. I have a slight preference for this personally, because although I've got used to the push button, the touch buttons in the Panamera, you still have to take your eyes off the road at the point where you need to use them, because you've got to get the touch button, even with the haptic feel, you have to get it absolutely perfect. Whereas here, you get used to where the buttons are, and you know, you can see, as Jeremy Clarkson might say, the central dash is festooned with buttons, and it certainly is. There is a button for absolutely everything. Other than that, only other change really, as per the Panamera, we have the Sport Chrono control on the steering wheel itself, which allows you to dial in Sport and Sport Plus, normal, and it's a good way of being able to get into the chassis control and the transmission settings that you want at the touch of a button. Over here we have another way of achieving that by going straight to the chassis settings, and there are both Sport and Sport Plus, something we didn't actually have in our Macan Turbo because we didn't have the Sport Chrono pack. Other than that, the dials in front of you are absolutely identical. Generally, I would say that the quality in the cabin is absolutely first rate. I have driven nothing that is better screwed together than Porsche on the road. Used to be Audi, but I believe Porsche have taken the lead, and BMW are fairly close. Now this car is actually fitted with the 18-way adjustable leather sports seats, possibly the best seats I've ever used as well. I had them in the Macan Turbo, and I think they're marginally better even than the sports seats in the Panamera. They are so comfortable. Alright guys, shall we move into the back and I'll show you how much room we've got in there. There is enough room in the back, but funnily enough, I'd say no more room in the back of the Macan than we have in the back of the BMW X1, and the X1 is noticeably smaller than this car. This car is around the same size as the X3, and I also, you know, I'm sitting quite upright and my head is touching the roof lining, which it didn't in the X1. So I think if you are going to do long distances with 4 adults in this car, it might be a consideration. But up front, wonderfully comfortable. So Porsche haven't mucked around with the suspension system too much, because this was already the best handling SUV in the market. Nothing really came close in terms of being able to chuck this down country lanes. The body control that you have when you do that is second to none, and certainly in a completely different class to the X3 from BMW and pretty much every other SUV out there, perhaps with the exception of Alfa Romeo's Stelvio Quattrofolio, which is supposed to be as good. But I would argue that this was the better overall package than the Alfa Romeo. But I will temper that with, that is what I've read. I've not actually driven the Stelvio. The car exudes quality. Porsche have got their quality absolutely spot on. Everything clunks when you close it. Really nice to live with on a day-to-day basis. And I had this, as I said, through the country lanes yesterday, across Headley Common, throwing it down rain-wise, and it was just completely sure-footed. Wonderful place to be when the conditions are less than perfect. So overall, very impressed with it. This one has the steel springs rather than air suspension. I think air suspension will be standard on the turbo and optional on the base level Macan and the Macan S. Personally, I slightly prefer the steel suspension, because the steel springs rather, because I have air suspension in the Macan, and unless I have it on Sport Plus, the suspension, it can slightly give you a feeling of floating over bumps, which I personally don't like, although wonderfully comfortable, because really you can travel over a very rough surface without it being uncomfortable for yourself or the occupants. But I think I'd stick with steel springs. If I know this one has got steel springs, I think I'd run with it if I was to buy a Macan S. And I rather suspect that the Macan S may be the choice of the range, because this one is coming in at 46,000 and a bit, and my understanding is the Macan S is 48,000 and a bit. Now what I have noticed in the real world with this is I'm getting 30 miles per gallon and struggling even on a good journey to improve upon that. So I think you've got to assume that your everyday driving will give you around 28. I don't think the figures from the Macan S are that much different to that, and yet you get a 6-cylinder engine, 100 and something brake horsepower more than you have in here. And sometimes in this car it can just feel a little underpowered. Body weight's about 1800 kgs. Is it a car I'd recommend? Absolutely. If I was in the market for a medium sized SUV, I would recommend the Macan in a heartbeat. Personally, I suggest getting the Macan S. Not a lot of extra money. Maybe you'll take a 1 or 2 mile per gallon hit on your fuel consumption, but otherwise I think Porsche have done pretty much what they needed to make it a little bit more modern, but they've kept it as the best handling SUV out there. Right guys, shall we hop in the car and we'll have a drive? Okay guys, well we're in the new Porsche Macan, and as you can see, it's very much situation normal. I do like the widescreen. The widescreen just makes the whole place feel more modern, and I like the positioning of the ventilation outlets. I think that's neat and tidy and looks more modern. I've always been a fan of push buttons rather than the touch buttons that are available in our Panamera and the new Cayenne. I just find it easier to get to, so you only need to take your eye off for a split second to see where the button is, or if you're familiar with the car, you're you know where they are already. So, you know, I'm going to isolate the cut-off switch that you have on all cars these days for travelling in traffic, and it's had the suspension tickled and refined a little bit, but in terms of the way that the car rides and the way that the car handles, it's very, very difficult to tell the difference. It may be that it's marginally better, but I don't notice the difference. It's a very nice place to be. Now, this is the base level, 242 brake horsepower, and not that dynamic, but still 6.7 to 62, which I think is pretty quick. I suppose it's all relative, isn't it? I mean, these days it's very difficult to know where you need these type of figures. To my knowledge, it doesn't have launch control, but I think possibly that would be out of character with the car itself. Now we can switch it into sport, which turns the dampers into their first sport setting. Obviously you have Sport Plus, and it just firms the suspension up as it did with the old car, and it's got a nice feel to it. I quite like the firm suspension when I'm on the motorway, because I feel you get more of the feel through the steering wheel than you do when it's in the normal setting. But for normal driving, I leave it in standard comfort mode. They call it normal mode. So a nice place to be. I'm very, very interested in owning another Macan myself personally. I'm tempted, I don't know whether you guys are aware, but I am tempted to wait for the next generation Macan, where apparently it's going to be fully electric, because I'm looking to move from the hybrid version that we have the Panamera in to a fully electric car, and I'm hoping that when the next generation is introduced, so 2021, by the time I get it, which will be 2022, there'll be many, many more charging outlets. Because obviously if you have a fully electric car, you can't get away with turning the engine on when you run out of battery range. But I mean, in today's world, I think, although the manufacturers claim 300 plus range on one electric charge, my own personal experience is you're looking at about 250, 260. And that only really becomes a problem if you're going a long distance. And hopefully by 2022 they'll have many, many, many stations on the way through Europe that allow you to charge 80% charge in 5 or 10 minutes. And that's the way it has to go. Otherwise it's really not practical. And you want to be able to get onto a charging unit as fast as you can get into a petrol station and onto a point. That's the challenge. And once they've got there, I think electric cars become a real possibility. Okay guys, well I am hoping you enjoyed that. It's Ian from SS8000 Cars signing off. Thank you for watching.